At 0150 on December 19, 1944, Private First Class Harry Miller crouched in the loader's position of a Sherman tank at Stoumont Station, Belgium, staring into the fog-choked road where German Panther tanks would emerge within the hour. 18 years old, 0 combat missions, 0 enemy tanks destroyed. Kampfgruppe had already driven 58 Panzers and 5,000 SS troops through the Ardennes, crushing 3 American divisions in 72 hours. Miller's hands were still stained black with grease from the night's labor. 18 hours earlier, the 740th Tank Battalion had possessed exactly 0 operational tanks. Lieutenant Colonel George Rubel's Daredevils had trained for 18 months in Arizona as a specialized searchlight unit. When that mission was cancelled in November, First Army promised them a full complement of M4 Shermans by January 1945. Instead, they received 9 borrowed tanks for training. On December 16, 1944, the Germans attacked. On December 17, First Army ordered those 9 borrowed tanks turned over to another unit. This left Rubel with 3 M5 Stuart light tanks and 2 assault guns. No medium tanks, no means to stop Panzers. Then someone at headquarters remembered the Freudmont Vehicle Depot. At 12:45 p.m. on December 18, new orders arrived: move to Freudmont, draw whatever armor you can find, get it running. At 1,400 hours, Captain James Berry had Company C rolling toward the depot. Miller followed with every mechanic the battalion could assemble. What they discovered stunned everyone. 3 tanks sat on the ready line, 3, all missing critical components. 25 other vehicles lay scattered across the depot yard, battle-damaged and stripped for parts. The depot personnel had evacuated so quickly they left half-eaten meals on tables. Miller drew a duplex-drive amphibious Sherman missing its breech block, all 3 machine guns, and the radio. Staff Sergeant Charlie Lupe received an M36 tank destroyer he had never seen before. Someone located 2 M24 Chaffee light tanks from a demonstration unit. Nobody had trained on Chaffees. The battalion worked through the night. Miller and his crew scavenged parts from wrecked vehicles in the salvage yard. They found a breech block in a burned-out Sherman. Machine guns came from a half-track with a shattered suspension. By 0200 on December 19, 3 Shermans and the M36 could move and shoot, barely. The radio in Miller's tank crackled with static. The gun traverse system leaked hydraulic fluid. The ammunition was old stock with faded markings. But orders had arrived 30 minutes earlier: move to Stoumont Station immediately. Paper had broken through, 12 miles west. First Army headquarters in Spa was preparing to evacuate. Kampfgruppe now sat just 1 bridge away from open highway to the Meuse River. If Paper reached the Meuse, he would split the Allied armies in half. British and Canadian forces in the north would be cut off. Eisenhower would face catastrophe. The only thing stopping Paper was fuel. His Panthers consumed gasoline faster than his supply trucks could deliver it. But intelligence reports indicated fuel convoys were moving up from Germany. When those convoys arrived, nothing would halt the SS advance except the handful of American units still holding defensive positions in the Amblève River Valley. At Stoumont, 1st Battalion of the 119th Infantry Regiment had been digging foxholes since December 18. These riflemen knew the German attack was coming, they simply did not know when. 8-toed 3-inch guns from the 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion covered the road. Everyone waited in the freezing fog for engines they could not yet hear. At 0700 on December 19, German paratroopers and SS Panzer Grenadiers attacked Stoumont village 2 miles east. Several Mark VI Tiger tanks accompanied them. 3rd Battalion, 119th Infantry, fought for every building. By noon, Paper controlled the village. Major General Leland Hobbs, commanding the 30th Division, faced a crisis. His 119th Infantry had just lost the last defensible position in the valley. Only the understrength 1st Battalion remained at the station. If they failed, Paper would reach L'Église by nightfall. If you want to see how Miller's scrapyard Sherman stopped the SS advance, please hit the like button, it really helps us share these forgotten stories. Subscribe if you have not already. Back to Miller. Miller climbed into his Sherman at 0300. The engine started on the second attempt. The radio functioned. The main gun traverse responded. He had never fired this specific tank's weapon, never driven this vehicle. The sights were not calibrated. But Lieutenant Charles Powers was leading 3rd Platoon down the Amblev Valley Road at 0345, and Miller's tank rolled 4th in column. Somewhere in the fog ahead, 3 Panthers were waiting, and Miller had exactly 30 minutes to learn whether 3 junk tanks assembled in one desperate night could stop the best armored unit Nazi Germany had. The Amblev River Valley Road ran barely wide enough for a single Sherman. Steep wooded cliffs rose 300 feet on the left. The Amblev itself ran deep and fast on the right, 40 feet across, too deep to ford. One road, one direction, no room to maneuver. The fog cut visibility to 75 yards. Temperature 18 degrees Fahrenheit, ice forming on every surface. Lieutenant Powers stood in his turret at 0345, scanning for targets through the murk. His Sherman crept forward at walking speed. Miller's tank followed 4th in column. The driver beside Miller gripped the controls so tightly his knuckles turned white. This replacement from Ohio had arrived in Belgium 6 days earlier, never fired the main gun in combat, never seen a Panther except in recognition manuals. Powers's column advanced 400 yards, 500, nothing but fog, frozen trees, and the echo of their own engines off the valley walls. At 0600, visibility improved slightly as dawn approached. Powers could see perhaps 100 yards ahead. The road curved right around a rocky outcrop. Beyond that Ben sat Stumont Station, the granite railway building that controlled access to the entire valley. Powers rounded the curve. A Panther sat 100 yards ahead, camouflaged with brush, its long 75mm gun trained directly down the road. The German crew had positioned their tank perfectly, commanding the entire approach. Any Sherman attempting to advance would have to expose itself completely while the Panther remained hull down and protected. Powers's gunner, Corporal Jack Ashby, fired before the German crew could react. The armor-piercing round struck the Panther's gun mantlet at a nearly perpendicular angle, deflecting downward into the driver's compartment. The German tank erupted in flames. Ammunition began cooking off inside the turret with sharp cracks that echoed down the valley. 4 German crewmen bailed out through the hatches, 2 were on fire. Powers advanced. Miller's tank followed, traversing left to cover the treeline where the German crewman had disappeared. The column moved another 150 yards past the burning Panther. At 0615, Powers spotted a second Panther, hull down behind a stone wall on the left side of the road. This crew had watched the first Panther burn, they were ready. Ashby fired. The armor-piercing shell struck the Panther's lower front slope at a shallow angle, ricocheting off and gouging a deep furrow without penetrating. The Panther's gun began to traverse toward Powers's Sherman. At that exact moment, Powers's loader reported the gun had jammed. A spent shell casing had failed to eject completely, wedged at an angle in the breech. Powers was helpless. Staff Sergeant Charlie Lupé's M36 tank destroyer rolled forward from 3rd position. Lupé had drawn this vehicle at the Freudmont Depot 18 hours earlier. He had never fired a 90mm gun before. His gunner, Corporal William Beckman, had never aimed one, but the M36 mounted the most powerful anti-tank gun in the American inventory, and the wounded Panther sat exposed at 100 yards, and Beckman had 3 seconds before the German gunner completed his traverse. Beckman fired. The 90mm armor-piercing round punched through the Panther's front plate like paper. He fired again. The second round penetrated the turret. Ring. He fired a 3rd time. That round hit the ammunition storage. The Panther exploded, its turret lifting 6 feet off the hull before crashing back down at an angle. No crew emerged. The explosion had killed everyone inside instantly. Powers's loader cleared the jammed gun. The lieutenant resumed his position at point. The column advanced another 150 yards through the fog. At 6:30, as full daylight arrived, Powers identified a 3rd Panther positioned in a farmyard on the right side of the road. This crew had concealed their tank behind a low stone wall. Only the gun tube and upper glacis were visible. Ashby fired. The armor-piercing shell struck the Panther's muzzle brake dead center. The brake disintegrated. The shell continued into the gun tube itself, detonating inside the barrel. The explosion opened the gun tube up like a flower. Steel.
petals blooming outward from the muzzle. The German crew abandoned their tank immediately. Their main weapon was destroyed. The Panther was useless. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Harrelong, commanding 1st Battalion 119th Infantry, halted the attack at 0635. In exactly 30 minutes, Company C had recaptured Stumal Station. 3 Panthers destroyed with 3 scrapyard Shermans and 1 borrowed tank. Destroyer. Piper's advance down the Humble Valley had stopped cold, but Miller knew this was just the beginning. Piper still commanded 55 operational tanks concentrated in Stumal Village, too. Me ahead, fuel convoys were moving up from Germany. At dawn on December 20th, the SS would counterattack with everything they had, and Miller's bastard Sherman would have to hold. Miller spent that first night at Stumont Station, curled up inside a Sherman like a dog. The temperature dropped to 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Ice formed on the inside of the turret. Every metal surface burned. Bare skin on contact. Sleep was impossible. All Miller could do was huddle against the loader, sharing body heat, listening to the 3 burning Panthers crackle and pop as their ammunition cooked off through the darkness. More tanks arrived from Fremont after midnight. Mechanics worked by flashlight, installing functional radios and calibrating gun sights. Fuel trucks appeared. Ammunition handlers passed shells up through the turret hatches, building up the ready racks. Artillery crews from the 30th Division brought their guns forward, digging firing positions in frozen earth. By dawn on December 20th, Company C had 14 operational Shermans. Not enough to match Piper's 55 remaining tanks, but enough to make him pay for every yard. Weather on December 20th remained brutally cold. Rain mixed with sleet, fog reduced visibility to 100 yards. At 0600, 2nd Platoon led by 1st Lieutenant John Calloway spearheaded the morning attack. Riflemen from 1st Battalion provided flank security through the woods. Artillery stood ready. The objective was Stumont Village. 2 miles ahead where Piper had concentrated his main force overnight, Calloway's Sherman rolled forward carefully, expecting ambush at every curve. The road climbed steadily away from the amblev into terrain that favored defenders. Stone walls provided cover. Farmhouses offered firing positions. Every barn could hide a Panther. At 0620, Calloway encountered his first target. A Panther sat hull down behind a stone wall, gun trained down the road. Calloway's gunner fired 1 armor-piercing round that struck the Panther's gun tube directly, entering the muzzle and detonating inside the barrel. The explosion opened the gun tube up like a rose, steel petals blooming outward. The German crew abandoned their disabled tank immediately. 2nd Platoon destroyed 2 SS half-tracks in the next 10 minutes. Then at 0640, Staff Sergeant Homer Thompson's Sherman hit a minefield the Germans had laid across the road overnight. The first mine detonated under the left track, blowing 18 track sections into the air. The second mine caught the right track before Tompkins could brake. Both tracks blown off. The Sherman sat immobilized in the middle of the road, blocking the entire advance. German MG-42 machine guns opened fire immediately. The SS had positioned multiple weapons to cover this minefield specifically. Tompkins popped his hatch. Bullets cracked past his head. His driver went out the bottom escape hatch. The gunner followed the loader. Tompkins went last, dropping from the turret end, sprinting for the ditch while rounds kicked up snow around his boots. All 5 crew members reached cover. 0 casualties, but the advance had stopped. American forces captured the hamlet of Targon by noon. After house-to-house fighting, Miller's Sherman provided covering fire from behind a stone barn, pumping high-explosive shells into suspected German positions. The heat inside the turret became suffocating despite freezing temperatures outside. 17 rounds fired, 23-31.
The loader worked mechanically, pulling shells from the ready rack, ramming them home, securing the breech, tapping Miller's shoulder to signal ready.
By 1500 hours,
American infantry and armor reached the eastern outskirts of Stoumont.
Late that afternoon, American soldiers occupied St. Edward Sanatorium, a massive brick building on a steep hill overlooking the battlefield. The sanatorium was a
natural fortress, 3 stories tall, thick walls, commanding fields of fire.
Whoever held that building controlled Stoumont. Piper understood this. At 2,300 hours, between 50 and 100 SS Panzer grenadiers launched a counterattack. Many
screamed as they charged up the hill.
Others fired Panzer from point-blank range. The Americans inside fought
desperately, but were overwhelmed by sheer numbers and fanaticism.
By midnight, the Germans had retaken the sanatorium and pushed the surviving Americans down the hill into the darkness.
Miller's Sherman sat at the base of the cliff below St. Edwards, unable to elevate its gun high enough to engage
targets inside the building. He could hear fighting above, grenades, automatic weapons, screaming.
His tank could do nothing.
At 0400 on December 21st, 1st
Lieutenant David Oblinsky Sherman crawled forward through darkness toward the sanatorium. Then, according to his driver, all hell broke loose. A hidden anti-tank gun fired 3 times.
All 3 shells penetrated. Olinsk's crew bailed out as flames erupted. 2 Panzer destroyed 2 more Shermans in the next 30 seconds. For tanks burning, the road completely blocked, and Piper was preparing his main counterattack. Lieutenant Colonel Rubel surveyed the disaster at dawn on December 21st. 4 Shermans destroyed, the road blocked. St. Edward's Sanatorium, held by the SS with commanding fields of fire. His battalion could not advance, could not retreat. Piper held Stoumont village with over 50 tanks and was bringing up fuel and ammunition for a major counterattack. Rubel needed a solution immediately.
From a hill near Taran, Rubel spotted a self-propelled 155mm howitzer that had just arrived with division artillery. He requisitioned it without asking permission. At 0800, Rubel positioned his personal artillery piece on the hillside and began shelling St. Edward's Sanatorium over open sights. The massive high-explosive rounds struck the brick building like sledgehammers. Rubel fired 50 rounds through the morning, methodically targeting each floor, each window, each section of wall. The Germans inside were stunned by the bombardment, but refused to surrender. Captain Berry thought of a different approach. That night, he crawled completely around the sanatorium and found a spot where a road might be built up the cliff face. Using volunteers from Company C and infantry engineers, Berry supervised construction of a corduroy track made from shot-up trees and empty shell casings. Service company recovery teams towed away the 4 wrecked Shermans under cover of a smoke screen. By dawn on December 22, Berry had maneuvered a platoon of tanks right up to St. Edward's walls. The Shermans fired through the sanatorium windows at point-blank range. High explosive shells detonated inside rooms where SS troops had barricaded themselves. Machine gun fire rad every opening. Soldiers of the 119th Infantry stormed through the front entrance while tanks suppressed the upper floors. By noon, Americans had recaptured the building. Nearly 250 civilians, many of them children, were found dazed but alive in the basement. They had been trapped there for 3 days. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Powers and Staff Sergeant Lupay destroyed 2 more lurking German tanks near the village edge. One was a Panther. The other was a captured American Sherman the SS had pressed into service. This broke Piper's defense line. The remaining SS troops in Stoumont fled east toward Leglace 2 miles away. Coordinated attacks by 2nd Battalion 119th Infantry and Combat Command B of The 3rd Armored Division moving south from Tropon drove them faster. By nightfall, December 22, American forces had advanced 2,000 yards past Stoumont. The 740th Tank Battalion had lost 5 tanks and 6 men wounded in 3 days of fighting. Miraculously, 0 daredevils had been killed. 1st Battalion 119th Infantry had suffered 106 casualties, including 18 killed, 60 wounded, and 28 missing. But Piper's advance had been stopped. His fuel situation was desperate. American forces now surrounded him on 3 sides. On December 23, Task Force Harrison prepared to assault Leglaise, where Piper had concentrated his remaining forces. Miller had been reassigned 2 days earlier to the assault gun platoon. 6 Shermans mounting 105mm howitzers instead of the standard 75mm gun. These assault guns provided fire support for infantry rather than fighting other tanks. The 105mm shells were heavy. Miller found them surprisingly difficult to handle as loader. At 0900, Miller's assault gun and 5 others rolled down a road bordered by woods and fields toward Chateau Fry on the eastern outskirts of Stoumont. Less than 2 miles west, Germans were making their stand in Lays. Lieutenant Colonel Rubble had positioned himself atop the chateau wall, directing fire like an artillery forward observer. When Rubble spotted an artillery crew towing a 155mm cannon eastward, he stopped them and had them set up behind the chateau. Rubble directed both the 6 assault guns and the 155, calling corrections after each shot. Miller passed 105mm shells to his gunner, who fired at targets Miller could not see. The chateau blocked his view. He only heard explosions and saw Legla's church steeple above the trees. Rubble's bombardment continued for over an hour, methodically shelling suspected German positions. The noise was deafening. Miller's ears rang so badly he could barely hear commands over the intercom, but the assault guns kept firing and Leglaise kept burning. And somewhere in that inferno, Piper was realizing his situation had become hopeless. Piper sat in his basement headquarters in Leglaise on the night of December 23 while American shells exploded overhead. His situation had deteriorated catastrophically. 9 days earlier, he had commanded 5,800 men and 58 tanks. Now he was trapped in a contracting perimeter with approximately 800 troops in 28 operational Panzers. No fuel, no ammunition resupply, no hope of reinforcement. American forces surrounded him on 3 sides. The 119th Infantry blocked the west. 3rd Armored Division pressed from the north. Paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne held positions across the Amblève at Chêne to the south. Artillery pounded Leglaise continuously. The 30th Infantry Division alone had fired over 57,000 shells into the area in 4 days. Every building was damaged. Most were burning. Dead SS troops lay in the streets where they had fallen. Piper had one option remaining. At 2,200 hours on December 23, he passed orders to his exhausted troops: destroy all equipment, abandon all vehicles, escape on foot through American lines. The men received this order with stunned silence. They had driven deeper into enemy territory than any German unit since 1940. They had crushed American divisions, murdered prisoners, burned villages, and now they were ordered to abandon their tanks and run like defeated infantry. Before dawn on December 24, what remained of CONF group of Piper filtered out of Leglaise on foot. They left behind 28 heavy tanks, including Panthers, Tigers, and King Tigers. 70 half-tracks sat, abandoned, 8 armored cars, numerous artillery pieces, over 4,000 dead, wounded, and captured. Of the original 5,800 men, only 800 escaped to German lines.
Piper's elite SS unit had been annihilated by determined American resistance at Stumal and Lays. Miller entered Leglaise on December 24. The village was devastated. Every building showed damage from shells or fire. Bodies lay everywhere in the rubble. Tiger tanks and Panthers remained, smoldering where they had been knocked out. The church still stood, badly damaged, its steeple riddled with holes. The only living things Miller saw were an American tank crew refueling next to the city hall and a few terrified civilians emerging from cellars. The 740th Tank Battalion received no rest after taking Lays. On December 29, they joined the 82nd Airborne Division for operations north of the Bulge salient. The temperature remained brutally cold. Snow fell constantly. Miller spent weeks living in his Sherman, sleeping in the loader's position when possible, eating rations that froze solid before he could finish them. The daredevils worked well with the aggressive 82nd. One paratrooper noted the 740th was the only tank outfit that could keep up with airborne infantry. January 1945 brought new missions. The battalion supported the 8th Infantry Division, then the 63rd, then the 86th. While infantry units occasionally rotated to reserve positions, the daredevils stopped only for maintenance and resupply. They were always moving, always fighting, always at the tip of some offensive spearhead. Miller learned to sleep while the tank was moving. Learned to eat while shells were exploding nearby. Learned to load the 105mm gun so efficiently he could maintain a rate of fire that amazed even experienced artillerymen. On March 30, the battalion loaded onto trains for movement north to Bonn. The 8th Infantry Division needed help closing the RER pocket. To reach the 8th, the 740th had to cross the Rhine River on a pontoon bridge. Miller did not like crossing a major river on floating platforms. The bridge rose and fell with each vehicle that crossed like riding a roller coaster. Miller watched the vehicles ahead going down between pontoons, hoping they would come back up. On the next section, his Sherman made it across, but the experience reminded him how precarious their situation remained. Even this late in the war, the battalion joined the fight to reduce the Ruhr pocket in early April. At one point, the tankers encountered a German airfield where Luftwaffe planes were attempting to take off. Miller's assault gun and others in the platoon opened fire on aircraft as they taxied onto the runway. The German pilots tried desperately to get airborne while Sherman gunners tracked them with high explosive shells. Several planes exploded on the ground. Others made it into the air only to be shot down immediately. It was a one-sided massacre that ended German air operations in that sector completely. By mid-April 1945, Allied forces had Germany surrounded. Soviet armies approached Berlin from the east. American and British forces pushed from the west. The Wehrmacht was collapsing on all fronts, but isolated pockets of resistance remained, and the 740th Tank Battalion continued grinding forward through these final battles. Miller had been in combat for 120 days straight. He had fired thousands of rounds, seen dozens of villages destroyed, watched German tanks burn, and German soldiers surrender by the hundreds. The initial fear he felt at Stoumont had been replaced by exhausted professionalism. Load the shell, ram it home, secure the breech, tap the shoulder, fire, repeat. The mechanical rhythm had become automatic. The daredevils crossed the Elbe River on April 30 at Blecket, Germany. The crossing was unopposed. German resistance in this sector had crumbled completely. Beyond the Elbe lay the Baltic coast and the Soviet advance. From the east, the 740th pushed north, joining British Second Army near Schwerin. On May 7, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Miller sat on his Sherman's turret that afternoon trying to process what the surrender meant. 138 days of
Continuous combat from December 19 when his battalion had 0 operational tanks to May 7 when they sat at the
Baltic Sea, having fought across Germany.
He had survived when so many others had
not.
His hands still worked. His hearing was damaged from months of gunfire, but
he could still function. He was alive. The final accounting for the 740th Tank Battalion was sobering.
43 officers and enlisted men killed in action.
57 tanks
lost, but the Daredevils had destroyed 69 enemy tanks, including 17 Tigers and
King Tigers.
They had smashed or captured 717 enemy vehicles.
They had
shot up 264 enemy aircraft, most caught on the ground.
They had breached the Siegfried Line twice with 2 different armies.
And they had stopped Camp Group Piper at Stoumont when it mattered most. Captain Barry received a Silver Star for his actions at Stoumont.
Lieutenant Powers received a Silver Star. Staff Sergeant Lupay received a Silver Star.
Every tanker who fought at Stoumont was awarded a Presidential Unit Citation. The citation specifically mentioned how the battalion stopped the furthest German advance in the Battle of the Bulge with hastily assembled equipment and incredible courage. Miller received no individual medals. He was a private first-class loader in an assault gun platoon, 1 man among 800 in the battalion, but he had been there on December 19 when 3 scrapyard Shermans faced Piper's Panthers at Stoumont Station. He had loaded shells,
while Lieutenant Colonel Rubel directed fire from atop Chateau Fry. He had crossed the Rhine on a pontoon bridge and the Elbe in the final weeks.
He had done his job when his country needed him.
The
740th remained in Germany on occupation duty through 1946.
Miller transferred stateside in June 1945.
He later served in Korea with General MacArthur's headquarters in the Communications Center. After Korea, he joined the Air Force and served during
Vietnam with Strategic Air Command, handling codes and cryptologology for command missions, including bombing runs.
He retired in January 1966 as a senior master sergeant after 22 years of
service.
For decades, the story of the 740th Tank Battalion remained obscure. The Battle of the Bulge histories focused on Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division held out against
overwhelming odds. Patton's Third Army relief of Bastogne became legendary.
Films were produced, books were published, memorials were raised.
But Stoumont, where the Daredevils halted Piper's spearhead with 3 hastily restored tanks, received little notice.
In 1998, veterans of the 740th erected a memorial marker in Baus, Arizona, where the battalion had trained. In 1999, the Belgian town of Neufchâteau dedicated a monument honoring the battalion. The names of all 800 men who served were engraved on that monument. The dedication ceremony was attended by only a small handful of surviving veterans.
Most were in their 70s and 80s by then.
Within another decade, only 6 remained able to attend the annual reunion.
Harry Miller lived quietly after retiring from the Air Force.
He worked as a private investigator in New Mexico, then as director of security at St. Vincent Hospital. Later, he became a safety inspector at the University of Texas at Arlington.
He retired once more in January 1989.
At age 69, he took up jazz and swing drumming, playing with bands in Seattle, Washington. He seldom spoke about the war.
Most veterans of the 740th followed similar paths. They returned home, found employment, raised families.
The war became something they had endured rather than something they talked about. When Miller's wife, Helen, died after 37 years of marriage, he moved to the Armed Forces Retirement Home in Washington, D.C. There, he occasionally encountered other World War II veterans.
Sometimes they spoke about their service.
More often, they did not. Paul Pearson, a tank commander in Company C during the battle, wrote a memoir titled Into the Breach in 2006. The book offered a detailed account of the battalion's combat operations from December 1944 through May 1945. Pearson had kept notes throughout the war. After retirement, he spent years researching official records and interviewing surviving veterans.
His book remains one of the few comprehensive histories of an independent tank battalion in the European theater.
The story of the 740th illustrates a broader truth about World War II. History tends to focus on dramatic last stands and celebrated victories. Bastogne became legendary because paratroopers held a surrounded town against impossible odds. Patton's relief column made headlines, but hundreds of smaller actions like Stoumont shaped the war's outcome just as decisively. Paper's failure to reach the Meuse meant Hitler's final gamble in the West collapsed. Had Paper broken through at Stoumont on December 19, the war might have dragged on for months longer.
The equipment used at Stoumont tells its own story.
American industrial capacity produced more than 49,000 Sherman tanks during the war. The Sherman was not the finest tank on the battlefield. German Panthers carried heavier armor and more powerful guns.
Tigers were nearly impervious from the front. But America built Shermans faster than Germany could destroy them. More importantly, American mechanics could repair Shermans rapidly using standardized components.
The tanks Miller's battalion assembled at the Froidmont Depot in a single night exemplified this philosophy: standardized designs, interchangeable parts, and crews trained to maintain their own vehicles. German armored doctrine emphasized technical superiority. Each Panther or Tiger was an engineering marvel with exceptional firepower and protection, but they were mechanically intricate, difficult to maintain, and consumed enormous quantities of fuel. When Paper's fuel supply was severed at Stoumont, his superior tanks became useless. The Shermans kept moving because American supply lines delivered fuel and ammunition without interruption. The Battle of the Bulge cost the United States approximately 89,000 casualties out of 610,000 troops engaged. It was the largest and bloodiest battle fought by American forces in World War II. German losses exceeded 100,000 killed, wounded, and captured. The Ardennes offensive drained Germany's remaining strategic reserves.
After the Bulge, the Wehrmacht could not launch another major offensive anywhere. The fate of Kampfgruppe Paper illustrates the battle's brutality. Of the 5,800 men who began the offensive on December 16, only 800 escaped L'Église by December 24, with more than 4,000 killed, wounded, or captured in 8 days. The unit never reformed.
Survivors were dispersed to other formations. Paper himself survived the war but was later murdered in France in 1976 by unknown assailants, possibly in retaliation for the Malmedy massacre. The 740th Tank Battalion Museum displays several artifacts at Fort Knox, Kentucky.
The National World War II Museum in New Orleans includes references to independent tank battalions.
A few Shermans used by the battalion were preserved in various military vehicle collections, but physical reminders of the unit remain rare.
Most of the hastily repaired tanks from the Froidmont Depot were scrapped after the war.
In 2016, Harry Miller visited the National World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C., with Harold Bradley, another veteran of the 740th.
Both men were in their late 80s. The Honor Flight Network, a non-profit organization, arranged the trip.
Miller stood at the memorial, looking at the names of the dead. He thought about the men who never came home, about the tankers killed in those 4 Shermans at St. Edward Sanatorium, about the infantry casualties at Stoumont.
Miller gave several interviews in his final years.
Army publications recorded his account of assembling tanks at the Froidmont Depot and the first engagement at Stoumont Station. When asked about his service, Miller said he was proud of everything he had done and wished he could do it all again.
He advised younger soldiers to stay in the service and retire with full benefits.
Miller passed away in 2017 at age 89, having served his country for 22 years across 3 wars. The 740th Tank Battalion was officially deactivated on July 23, 1946. 13 members gave their lives for their country during World War II. The battalion fought in the Ardennes, Alsace, Rhineland, and Central Europe campaigns. They served under the 1st, 3rd, 7th, and 9th U.S. Armies, the 1st Allied Airborne Army, and the British 2nd Army. Few independent tank battalions in the European theater can match this operational record.
The memorial at Baus, Arizona, still stands where the battalion trained in 1943 and 1944.
The marker lists the battalion's combat record and honors all who served. Veterans donated the memorial in 1998, determined that future generations would remember the daredevils. Few visitors stop at this remote location, but the memorial remains a quiet testament to 800 men who trained in the Arizona desert and stopped the SS in the Belgian snow.
The monument at Neufchâteau, Belgium, was dedicated on April 24, 1999. Every name from the battalion roster was engraved on its surface.
Belgian citizens attended the ceremony alongside American veterans. The town remembered how the 740th helped liberate them, how these tankers stopped Paper's advance, how 3 hastily repaired Shermans altered the course of the Battle of the Bulge. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor and hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to share this story with more people.
Hit subscribe and turn on notifications.
We are rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day, stories about tankers and mechanics who saved lives with scrapyard Shermans and sheer determination.
Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. Are you watching from the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia?
Our community spans the entire world.
You are not just a viewer. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location.
Tell us if someone in your family served.
Let us know you are here.
Thank you for watching, and thank you for ensuring that Harry Miller and the Daredevils do not fade into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you are helping make that possible.